Live. All right. Good morning. Thanks for joining us here on Ask the Agronomist this morning. We're coming to you from Elliott Brothers Seed near Monmouth, Illinois. So I've got the winged deer on the back wall back there. Always like that. I appreciate those guys for loaning me their office space, as well as their daughter, producer Jennifer, here today. Now be kind to Jennifer. Jennifer has helped us with Ask the Agronomist almost since the beginning. And I've actually tried to get her in the producer's chair, but she's always felt like we needed another agronomy person in the producer's chair to converse with the agronomist. And I've assured her that that is not necessary. This is not Ask the Producer. This is Ask the Agronomist. And so she can just pass all the tough questions to me. We don't need to have the banter that Adam and I sometimes enjoy having. So she will do great, and appreciate her help here this morning. She's always the technical support behind the scenes, making everything work smooth, because Adam and I don't know what in the hell we're doing when it comes to that kind of stuff. So appreciate Jennifer helping me out here this morning. Appreciate you all joining. So once again, here on Ask the Agronomist, what we love to do is answer your questions. I have had a great 2 weeks worth of text and email questions that have came in to me from listeners. Some of those were excellent, and we're going to spend a fair amount of time here this morning covering a couple of those. So you might recognize your question, and one of you, I'm probably going to call you out on here, because I love all your questions so much and appreciate that. So if you want to chat in a question, Jennifer's watching the chat, so we always move those chatted in questions up on the priority order to make sure we get to those. So if you're logged in on your YouTube account or any Google email account, you can use the live chat feature. If you're not comfortable with that, you can always text me a question or email me a question, and or get those questions to your FSR. They might perhaps be watching this morning, and maybe they could chat the question in on your behalf. So anyway, with that, we'll start with just a really quick harvest update. Lots of soybean harvest going on. A lot of us who gave preferential treatment to corn because we thought we had to before it fell down are trying to get caught up on soybeans. We have been blessed here this week with some really nice weather for harvesting soybeans. You know, soybeans are gaining a couple points of moisture every night, and then you lose that couple points through the day, and then they gain it back the next night. So staying cool, a little bit cloudy. We're not getting down to 8-9% soybeans, at least not yet around here. So it's really working out nicely so far. We're not going to get soybeans done before the next rain event, which sounds like it's coming pretty likely on Sunday. And there are some forecasts that talk about November being wet. So people who got their beans done and have corn left that's still standing are maybe going to feel like they're the smart ones. People who have corn left that's not still standing but have a lot of beans done don't quite know what to think. On my own farm, I made the decision that you cannot harvest down corn or beans when it's wet. So we stayed on corn and have just a little smidgen of corn left to do. But we're full bore on beans now, as are most other people. Soybean yields continue to be a pleasant surprise and generally impressive across the area. Field averages in the 70s, fairly common, occasionally 80 plus. Frankly, I'm shocked. Adam and I talked about this a little bit 2 weeks ago. I did not anticipate this good of a bean crop. So while the corn crop's been a little disappointing, or for some people a lot disappointing, the bean crop has been a pleasant surprise, and that's nice to see that. If you're going to have one crop that's a little disappointing, it's nice to kind of offset that with a pleasant surprise from the other one. So anyway, with that, we got a lot of stuff that has either been emailed or chatted in or texted in. So we'll go ahead and kick things off. So my friend Tom Kennel, I'm going to call Tom out on air here this morning, and I hope Tom's listening. He sent me an email that I told Jennifer, I said, there's a half an episode of Ask the Agronomist in Tom's email. So thanks to Tom for being a loyal listener and sending me some really, really good material. So I just printed off your email here, Tom, and I'm going to touch on some of the things you asked about. So you had a lot in there about crown rot. And crown rot has been a huge topic of conversation. Adam and I have discussed it on several previous episodes. I actually had two different people send me really good questions around crown rot this week. So I don't want to belabor the point because I think we've talked about it a lot already. But one of Tom's questions was, am I planting my corn too early? He had observed some neighboring fields that got planted later that looked like they had better late season health. I saw that as well. I do think that the corn that was in the ground, the earlier planted, like around Easter weekend corn, probably did suffer the most from some of the crown rot infections that we had. And then as you went through April, in some cases it got better, in some cases it didn't. I mean, I would say all the April planted corn had plenty of crown rot in it, and that's due to the cold, stressful conditions, wet conditions early, perfect conditions at planting time, but after planting, things got wet. It was cold. Even at planting time, it was cold. There were people that were asking, the soil's perfect planting conditions, and if you believe in the condition, if the soil's fit, you should plant. Ignore the temperature. Well, then you planted a lot of corn. If you were worried about calendar date and temperature, you tended to be a little more patient on corn. Then through Mother's Day weekend, things were still pretty challenging, cold, lots of moisture. So until you get, I'm going to say, past Mother's Day, so that mid-May and later planted corn was healthier from a root rot perspective. Now, it may have suffered more from tar spot and southern rust and some of the other foliar diseases than the April planted corn did. In some cases, it didn't. So it kind of varied. A lot of variability this year. We've talked about that too. You have to be very careful what conclusions you make from this year regarding anything related to management or anything related to hybrid, because the environmental differences were just so extreme. It really skews things. But I would say in general, mid-May and later planted corn had less crown rot. There was some really late planted corn in areas that went in June, and that corn has been very poor this year as a general rule. So we've had years, 2019 recently was one where June planted corn suffered very little yield penalty. That was not the case this year. Now, that June corn had very little crown rot, but tar spot and other foliar diseases was a lot harder on that corn. Plus, the June corn tended to be in the wet areas and wet fields. Some of it was replant. Some of it was a field that just really, you didn't get to before it got wet, and then it was too wet. So you got to also consider that this was a really bad year for corn in wet, poorly drained soils. And most of that June planted corn went into wet, poorly drained soils. That's why it was planted in June in the first place. So in some cases, it was, not only was it maybe planted in an inopportune time, it was also going into a pretty challenging environment. But back on the crown rot for a moment, the other thing that Tom had observed, and he thought this was a little odd, was that some of these fields that had less crown rot in them were actually organic fields. And so in a true organic field, there'd be no seed treatment on that seed. We talk about our EDC seed treatment helping to suppress crown rot. Well, there'd be completely untreated seed if it's an organic field. But also, if you think about organic fields, probably lower fertility. Obviously, a lot of times the yield target is lower. The population's probably lower. Crown rot is also a high yield environment disease. The higher you push your fertility, the higher you push your populations, the higher you push your yield potential. If you've set 280 plus as your potential, that plant's going to be under quite a bit of stress during grain fill, trying to finish filling that ear, which that relates to another one of Tom's good questions that we'll get to in a minute. But there's a lot of factors that influence crown rot other than planting date. Planting date's a big one. Soil type is a big one. Weather is huge. Management is another. Yield level is another. So you tend to see a lot less of it on low organic matter soils. So it's a little bit like sudden death syndrome in soybeans. And actually, Fusarium species is one of the primary species involved in crown rot complex in corn. SDS is also a Fusarium species in soybeans. Two different Fusariums. There's a lot of Fusariums, but they do have that in common. And both of those diseases, crown rot in corn, sudden death syndrome in soybeans, are primarily black soil, high organic matter diseases. You rarely find bad crown rot in corn on a white chalky timber soil, and you very rarely find bad sudden death syndrome in soybeans on white timber soil. And that's why in some cases this year, with all the moisture we had, there's been some lighter timber soils that's actually been out yielding, sometimes significantly, the good flat black ground, which is where some of those pathogens tend to be more prevalent. So there's a lot of factors other than just planting date, but planting date is one. And then that leads to the question of, well, should we wait to plant corn? A lot of guys experiencing great success with early April planted soybeans. So should we start on beans, let the corn wait till May, and then plant corn? Well, we've had back-to-back two Mays in a row where early May was a horrific time to plant corn because of huge rain events that we had in the early part of May. And we had a lot of suffocated soils. We had a lot of suffocated seeds. We had a lot of replant. And so the last 2 years, probably one of the worst planting windows for corn happened to be early May. Early May actually should be the best time to plant corn. And there are people that are wondering, well, if our weather patterns have changed and we're going to continue to get these, more frequent heavy storm events in early May, well, I either want to be planting after that or long enough before that my crop's already up before those soils get saturated from those early May rains. I'm not personally convinced that early May is forever going to be a crappy time to plant corn. It could just be bad luck that we've had 2 back-to-back years where that was the case. So I'm really wanting to see a good early May corn planting window here one of these years, just to remind people that that's not a crazy, stupid idea to plant corn in late April and early May. That actually should be the best time to plant corn. And historically it has been. So unless our weather patterns have changed so radically that what we think we know, we don't know anymore, I'm still going to say that there's not a thing wrong with planting your beans first and targeting that late April, early May window for corn. I get maybe one more bad Mother's Day weekend in a row here, and maybe I'll have to change my tune. But for the time being, I don't see anything wrong with starting with beans if you want to. Letting that soil get a little warmer, getting later in that calendar date. Now, if you've got 20,000 acres of corn to plant, probably can't afford to do that. If it's fit in early April, you're going to be planting corn. I get that. If you've got 1,000 acres of corn to plant, you can be a little more picky and choosy as to what days you plant. Most of us can plant our corn in about 5 days if things go well. So, if you can plant all your corn in 5 days, you don't really need to start planting corn on Easter weekend. You're going to have 5 days between the 1st of April and the middle of May, most years, that are good for planting corn. So, I think the early planted bean thing is here to stay. We've talked a lot about the challenges that creates logistically and from a herbicide standpoint, keeping the fields clean. What's the best herbicide program for early planted beans? And we may touch on that more in later episodes before spring gets here. But, all those things that people observed this year are true as far as later planted corn having less crown rot in general. And crown rot was a huge driver in late season stalk quality, late season plant health, and corn yield. So it also interacted with tar spots. So the tar spot that came along later definitely made crown rot worse. Now, the crown rot infection happened long before the plant even knew tar spot was going to be a thing. So those crown rot pathogens have been in that plant's root system since it was about yay tall. And they hang out in that root system, and they don't even cause a lot of trouble until the plant gets under stress during grain fill. When the plant gets under stress during grain fill, those crown rot infections just fire up. That root system that was already compromised by the infections gets sicker and sicker and sicker. So as your root system declines, your plant's under stress trying to fill an ear. What do you need? You need good roots. You need good roots to be able to get resources to finish filling that ear. your root system's compromised. You can't get the nutrition you need. Every day the plant is more and more stressed. It cannibalizes itself, trying to save that ear, trying to finish that ear, compromises stalk quality, and eventually it gets so bad it just dies. And when that plant goes from green with an upright ear to off green with an upright ear to silver with a tipping over ear to brown with a dropped over ear in about 4 days, that's what crown rot does. And you get that premature prior to black layer death. You get that little shallow light kernel. All the kernels are there. You had a good kernel count, but you didn't have good kernel fill. And that kernel fill is what we're missing this year. And we had a great discussion 2 weeks ago, or at least Adam and I thought it was great. You might not have, but about, where the yield went and why our yield checks were off so far. And just a good conversation about, what drives yield in corn, and kernel depth and kernel fill is a huge component of that. And that's really what we're missing this year. If your yields are 60 or 80 bushel off of where you thought they would be, generally it's because of a very light, very shallow, not heavy kernel. And that's where that missing yield went. So,
Lance, real quick.
Yes.
I've got a question here about fungicide application when it comes to crown rot. So obviously it would have been super beneficial this year because of the disease pressure that we had with tar spot and southern rust. But what's your thoughts on spraying fungicide and how it interacts with crown rot in general? Yep.
So good question. And I think that those early fungicide applications, when I say early, I'm not talking pre-tassel. I'm talking when you're spraying herbicide early. So at least V4, prefer V5, V6, V7, somewhere in there. So V5 is the stage that we talk about the most, because V5 fits relatively well with a lot of standard post-corn herbicide programs. Now, if you're posting corn at V2, you really can't wait till V5 without changing your herbicide program. And if you don't want to do that, then this isn't for you. And we also don't want to be spraying a bunch of herbicide at V6 or V7. So V5 is kind of a sweet spot where the corn is big enough to intercept enough fungicide to get a good fungicide in its system, helps with some of the minor foliar disease like anthracnose leaf blight that can be out there at that time, gives the plant a little bit of a plant health pick-me-up right when it's determining initial ear size. But the main thing that we're looking for at that application, with a product like Delaro, is suppression of crown rot. And we have looked at I had another one of my questions for this week, and I'll go ahead and touch on it now because it applies, was about, in furrow treatments going after crown rot. So if you're set up on your planter to do in furrow fertilizer, there are products, some people use insecticide in that application. There are some biologicals. There are a lot of fertility products that go out at that time. There are some fungicides that can be used at that time. And if you're set up for those in furrow treatments, how do those compare with a V5 fungicide? My colleague, Chris Callowell, has done a lot of trials over the years looking at crown rot. Chris has probably studied crown rot as much as anybody I know personally. And he's looked at several different in furrow fungicide treatments, competitive products, Bayer products, some biological stuff, and year in and year out, Chris has yet to find anything in furrow that's been better than a V5 foliar application of a good fungicide. And since most people are not set up for in furrow treatments on their planter, if we find a product, and we've looked at some of the competitive products that are promoted as being great for those in furrow applications, and we haven't really found one that just knocked our socks off yet. If we do find one that makes me want to invest in putting a system on my planter so that I can do an in furrow treatment, I'll be the first one to do it, because I'm big on crown rot being one of the major things that's really year in and year out holding our corn yields back. Especially if you're progressive, high fertility, like to plant early, high populations, shooting for 300 bushel corn, that's a perfect environment for crown rot. So we've looked at the in-furrow stuff. We've seen some benefit, but we haven't seen anything in furrow that gave a bigger benefit than the V5 did. Now, I'll be honest, we have not looked at in-furrow and V5 together a lot. It's generally been one or the other. So if you're set up to apply an in-furrow product, and if you're working with a supplier that believes they have an in-furrow product that will help, I would certainly use it. And I would do some trials on your farm where you've got that product by itself versus nothing. You've got a V5 fungicide versus nothing, and then you stack them both together versus either one individually or nothing. That would be a fairly easy, climate field view trial to do on an 80-acre field, because the in-furrow products, you can have a batch of fertilizer with them and without them. And then the V5, you can have a batch of herbicide with it and without them, and it's not that difficult to do. There are a few people I will mention. I mentioned that V6, V7 timing. You don't have to hit V5. V6 or V7 would be fine. There'd be a benefit there as well. That's kind of late for your herbicide. So we don't like to promote that if you're hitching a ride with the herbicide. If you're spraying herbicide at V2 or V3, you can't hitch a ride anyway. And I do know a few people that are serious enough about this. They're going to make another pass just to put the fungicide on. If you're willing to do that, you don't have to do it at V5. Somewhere between V5 and V7 would be fine. And if you want to throw in some micronutrients and do some other things while you're there, have at it. V7 is not a good time to be spraying herbicide, but it is a good time to spray fungicide, micronutrients, other things that you might want to do. So I think hopefully that fairly well addressed the V5 crown rot conversation. So I think one of the other good questions that Tom had, and I'm not trying to turn this into the Tom Kennel show, but my friend Tom sent me some really good stuff. So it actually gave me an idea that I want Jennifer to think about, is that it'd be nice to have like a featured grower of the week that sent in a question. So if we start getting enough good questions coming in, I'd like to think about doing something like that. Jennifer's smiling and nodding. So that's something we'll think about. So. But anyway, there was another interesting question about second ears on corn. So the operation that Tom's involved in is pretty progressive. They're planting, what I would consider to be typical, moderate to high populations. And at the populations they plant, they aren't expecting to see a second ear. They had some fields this year that just, due to the environment, due to the conditions, due to the things being, pretty right, I'm going to say, leading up to pollination and through pollination, they had some fields that, even though they planted 36,000 and had a good stand, they had a small second ear on a lot of plants, and they were surprised to see that. So, what generally drives that second ear is excess resources above and beyond what the primary ear can consume at the time of pollination. So if for some reason your plant wasn't feeling the best early season and it set a slightly smaller first ear for some reason, so let's say the plant wasn't feeling the best, let's say it was crown rot, let's say it was cold, let's say it was wet, let's say it was a lack of nitrogen, who knows what the issue might have been. But if that plant was a little conservative on the first ear early, so that ear size, initial ear size is set, girth is set by V5, and length is determined by a couple weeks prior to tassel. So if in that early season that plant was not feeling the best and it set a modest size first ear, and then by the time pollination came around, things were good, plant was healthy, good moisture, it had more resources than that primary ear could consume. A corn plant has an ear shoot at every node below the ear. So the primary node or the primary ear is your uppermost ear shoot. And then every node below that also has an ear shoot. Typically, the plant has only got enough groceries, so to speak, to fill that first ear. But if it's got more groceries than that first ear can consume, it will divert, doesn't rob from the first ear. And that's another part of Tom's question. First ear takes what it needs, If there's nothing left over, nothing for the second ear. If there's a little bit left over, second ear gets some groceries too. So in Tom's case, what they observed was that second ear actually filled 5 or 10 kernels. So there wasn't much there. There had been more that pollinated, and then they aborted. So what that meant was at pollination time, that plant thought it could make like an ear and a half. After pollination, it realized, oops, can't quite make an ear and a half. I'll make an ear and 5% of an ear. And so that's kind of what they ended up with. So the question was, did that rob from the primary ear when it was trying to fill those kernels on the second ear? And would I have had better yield if the second ear had never even been there? So kind of that sucker theory, is the second ear robbing from the first ear, and would it actually have yielded better if there was no second ear there at all? And I'm going to say no. I'm going to say the first ear, kind of like back in the old days, the firstborn son got everything, right? So the first ear gets everything, and the second ear only gets what the first ear doesn't want. And so I don't think that second ear, now, if the second ear went through the stripper plates on the corn head and didn't get harvested, then yeah, that was kind of a wasted resource, that the plant made kernels that didn't end up in the grain tank. But I don't think that the fact that there was a second ear there made the corn yield less or made the first ear less than it could have been. Now, some early season stress may have made the first ear less than it could have been, and that's why the second ear was there in the first place. But, a second ear is generally an indication that we could have had a higher seeding rate. But this year was not a particularly great year to be pushing populations really high because of all the crown rot, all the stress, all the disease. We've had plenty of stock quality problems this year with standard seeding rates, and a higher seeding rate would have done nothing but make that worse. So I wouldn't be alarmed if you're seeing second ears. What a second ear tells me is that plant was feeling really, really, really good right after pollination, and it was trying to be all it could be, and it couldn't be all it could be with one ear, so it made a small second ear. Now, if you reduce your seeding rate down, you're going to get a lot of second ears, and those ears will have significant yield on them. What we see in population studies very, very consistently is you're better off having more plants, because your plant is your factory, your leaves are your factory, the ear is the output. You want as much factory as you can have. So the factory is the leaves, and having more factories with one ear on a stalk is going to out yield having fewer factories with more yield on each individual plant. The yield of an individual plant will be maximized at the lowest seeding rate possible. The yield of an acre will be maximized at a much higher seeding rate. And so we're more worried about the yield of the acre than we are the yield of the plant. We've really, through plant breeding and all this great genetics that we talk about and all the work that our breeders do, we've done relatively nothing to increase the yield of an individual corn plant. An individual corn plant could have made, 6 ears 100 years ago. And if you planted that plant by itself and treated it right, it'd have 6 nice ears on it. But if you planted those particular plants at 35,000 plants per acre, they would have probably all been barren because they couldn't handle the stress. So we have bred corn, improved corn, I would say, to tolerate high populations and tolerate stress, because it's really the population that's driving the yield increase of modern corn, rather than the fact that the corn plant can yield more than it did 100 years ago. An individual corn plant can't really yield any more today than it did 100 years ago. But 100 years ago, you were planting 12,000 plants per acre hill dropped. And today we're planting 36, 38,000, and you're having 36,000 ears that were the same size as the 12,000 ears that you had 100 years ago. So that's really where the yield increase is coming. Corn is driving population. Anything else come in, Jennifer, while we've been talking here?
Not yet, but I do want to talk about, because just to give our listeners some context here, I'm in a much more southern territory than what Lance is. So I'm about the southern portion of our team. So I'm probably about 95% done with corn and about 40% with beans. So I'm starting to see fertilizer trucks on the roads out in my territory and get into fields. So when do you think that's time to start putting out Anhydrous, Fertilizer? When are we really trying to hit those? When can we go get started? When's too early? When's too late?
Yep. I appreciate you bringing us back around to fertility, because I did want to spend some time on fertility. That's been kind of a hot topic as well. Now that we've kind of, somewhat figured out what's going on with harvest, people's minds are, getting in that what's next gear. And for us, what's next is typically a lot of fall fertilizer work. If you've been talking to your supplier, you know that unfortunately fertilizer costs are pretty outrageous, and there's concerns around supply of fertilizer. So in some cases, it may not be, are you willing to pay the price? It may be, do they have the product that you need? So if you haven't started having those conversations with your suppliers, I would. To answer Jennifer's question directly, when should we start applying fall anhydrous? Typically we are a big fall anhydrous market here in central and northern Illinois. And the old traditional school recommendation is we shouldn't start until soil temperatures are below 50 degrees. I haven't looked at a soil temperature lately, but it's nowhere near down to 50 yet. So a lot of people look at that. I talked to a guy the other day, and he said, I always thought we shouldn't start till November 1st. And I said, well, I usually say Halloween, which, that's basically the same thing. Yeah. The last day of one month or the first day of the next. And there's always a few early birds out there that go earlier than that. It's risky from an environmental stewardship standpoint. We don't really want that nitrogen to end up in the nitrate form in the fall. So if you put it on early enough and you've got warm enough soils that it all ends up being nitrate before winter gets here, that means it's all laying there. It'll be fine through the winter. But next spring, if we have a wet spring and we can't plant early and you've got all your nitrogen is already converted to nitrate, if you're, another way to say this that might make sense to people, if your anhydrous all gets into the nitrate form in the fall, essentially that would be no different than spraying 28 or UAN in the fall. All of your nitrogen is in a losable form once it reaches the nitrate stage. So that's typically why some sort of an inhibitor is recommended with fall anhydrous applications to prevent the conversion to nitrate. Now that prevention only lasts so long, and that 50-degree soil temperature recommendation includes typically the recommendation to use an inhibitor. So if your soil's 50 degrees or below and you're using an inhibitor, that should, unless we have some freakishly warm December, that should keep your nitrate in a stable, non-losable form until spring. And that's really the goal. If you push the calendar date or push the soil temperature levels, even if you're using an inhibitor, that inhibitor is only going to inhibit the conversion for so long. And the warmer the soil is, the shorter amount of time it's going to last. I did have an interesting question came in this week. Someone was wondering about using a higher rate of inhibitor, which you would need to check the labels of the product that you're using to make sure that's even allowed. We don't make off-label recommendations here on Ask the Agronomist. So if your inhibitor only has one rate on the label and it doesn't say anything about a higher rate, then a higher rate would be an off-label application. So just so you're aware of that. But if the product does have the flexibility of using a higher rate will probably lengthen the amount of time that it's going to do what it's supposed to do, which is inhibit the bacteria that are involved in the conversion process. So when you apply anhydrous ammonia, this is a little bit of chemistry here, and it's only a little bit of chemistry because I'm not good at chemistry. If Adam's here, I'd turn this part over to him probably. But so anhydrous ammonia is NH3 plus. So a nitrogen and 3 hydrogens. Ammonium is NH4 plus. So very quickly, after you apply anhydrous, it absorbs water. From that water, it takes a hydrogen. Hydrogens, there's 2 hydrogens on every oxygen, make a water molecule. So if you're having flashbacks to chemistry, I'm sorry. So it cleaves off that hydrogen from that water molecule, makes ammonium. Ammonium is a positively charged cation in the soil. And as long as it stays ammonium, it's fairly safe. It's not going to leach. It's not going to denitrify. The challenge is you can't keep it in the ammonium stage long term because, and corn plants can use ammonium. Some people I'm not one of these people, but you will find people that think that corn plants even prefer ammonium nitrogen. I haven't seen a lot of data that has convinced me that the corn plant cares whether it's getting ammonium or nitrate. But it is true that ammonium, because it's positively charged, can be loosely held by the soil, isn't going to leach, isn't going to denitrify as readily as nitrate does. But what happens naturally in the soil is naturally occurring soil bacteria. They're there. They're just doing their thing. They convert that ammonium to nitrite, which is toxic. So you don't want nitrite, and it quickly converts to nitrate. So NH3 goes to NH4, goes to NO2, goes to NO3. So that's nitrification. And that is the conversion that naturally occurs when you apply anhydrous ammonia. It's going to end up eventually as nitrate. If you're applying an inhibitor, what the inhibitors do, they inhibit the bacteria for a period of time, not forever, for a period of time, that are converting ammonium to nitrite to nitrate. So they convert, you don't want to inhibit, there's different species of bacteria involved. If you inhibited the one that went from nitrite to nitrate, that'd be really bad, because nitrate is toxic to plants. Nitrate, only change one little letter and one more oxygen, but makes a big difference as far as the plant's concerned. So that's what the inhibitors are doing. They only do it for so long. They do it for less of a period of time the warmer the soil is. So if you put an inhibitor in 60-degree soil, it's not going to do its thing as long as if you put it in a 50-degree soil. And really what the inhibitors are designed to do is protect us from that warm snap that happens after we apply our nitrogen. So let's say we're being good stewards, and let's say we wait till it's 50-degree soil temp, and let's say you go out there and put it on, and then a week later, the soil temperature's back up to 60. Well, that's when you really need that inhibitor there, inhibiting those bacteria to keep that nitrogen, even though the soil's still warm, to keep it in the ammonium form. Once soil temperatures decline through the winter months, biological activity slows to such a pace that that corn plant or that nitrogen will kind of hang out there in the status quo. But that's what that inhibitor is doing. So generally speaking, I would say, if you're using an inhibitor, which you should be, I would still like to see, 50-degree soil temperatures and a forecast that looks like we're not going to have a bunch of 80-degree weather that's going to warm that soil back up. What's the risk of that? Well, the risk is if it gets wet and we lose the fall, then you didn't get your fall nitrogen on. And this year, if you prepaid fall nitrogen versus spring applied nitrogen, which if you prepaid fall, you got to get it on the fall. Your prepay fall price isn't going to carry over to spring for you in most cases. And if there's a $400 a ton difference between your prepay fall price and the spring price, pretty big incentive to get it on this fall. And if you're worried about not being able to get it on this fall, well, then that makes you want to go early. So there's, you can look like a genius, or you can look like something other than a genius, depending on how things go. So once again, that old agronomy adage, it depends, applies here. So when you're looking, when you put economics in and you put yield potential in and you balance that with environmental stewardship and doing the right thing, sometimes you get into some gray areas. And so every year there's always somebody that's got to be first. And generally the first guys out pulling anhydrous tanks around are above 50-degree soil temperatures, and they're before Halloween. And everybody's looking at them thinking, well, what's that guy doing? And should he be doing that? And sometimes if it's early enough and warm enough, somebody from Department of Ag or FCA is on the phone saying, hey, probably shouldn't be doing that, making us look bad. Give it another week or 10 days. But it just depends on, what the fall conditions are like. It depends on what the spring weather's like. If we have a dry spring, doesn't matter. Nitrogen's not going anywhere in a dry soil. Bad things only happen to nitrogen in a wet soil. So if it's a dry spring, you could probably put anhydrous on in August. It'd be fine. If it's a wet spring, the later you put it on, the better. If you wait late enough into the fall, which this is an even bigger risk that you might not be able to do it, but there are people that say, well, what if I wait till middle of December to put my anhydrous on? Do I still need the inhibitor? In theory, no. you probably don't. If you wait that late, the risk then is, can you get it done? And if you don't get it done and your 7-something anhydrous becomes 11-something anhydrous in the spring, that's a pretty big hit to the pocketbook. So I guess that's my thoughts on nitrogen. Relative to dry fertilizer is pretty crazy as well. Likely will be some shortages on products. Likely will be some pricing that you don't like. And I think, there are things we can do to be more efficient with our dry fertilizer. So, I'm a big soil testing person. So if your soil tests indicate that your soils are in good shape, it's not a sin to skip a year. So, if you've got really high soil fertility levels, maybe this is a year to make a little bit of a withdrawal from that bank account and just let that fertility go for a year. If you've got, maybe a lease that requires you to put fertilizer back on, maybe have a conversation with your landlord and see if there's any flexibility on that. See if we could, wait for a year down the road with more moderate prices to maybe make some catch-up applications. I like to put on removal rate fertility based on yield maps. So I yield map every acre, and then we spread fertilizer to put back what we took off. This is probably not a year to be doing a lot of soil buildup, because soil buildup takes, a lot extra fertility. It's more economical to feed the crop than it is to build the soil. So in the case of potassium, you're putting on 4 pounds to raise your soil test 1 pound. In the case of phosphorus, you're putting on 9 pounds to raise your soil test 1 pound. So just feeding the crop is more economical than trying to build up the soil. So this is maybe a year just to worry about feeding the crop. If you're capable of making fertility applications based on yield, I really like that. The place in the field that made 260 needs to have more fertilizer put back on it than the place over here that made 160, and that's okay. Typically, if you look at your soil test values, the places that always yield 240 versus the places that always yield 160, the place that always yields 160 actually has higher soil fertility than the place that always yields 240. It's because you're removing more than you're putting on in that good spot, typically, and you're putting on more than you're removing in that bad spot, typically. So over time, the lower yielding parts of your field, you have built the fertility up more than you've built it up. You maybe mined it in the high yielding parts of the field. And so that's the argument for varying rates based on yield rather than varying rates based on soil tests. Now, if you want to get really fancy, and I do like this, you can, if your fertilizer guy is a good enough mathematician to build a script that incorporates both the soil test and the yield map, that's the best of both worlds. So if you've got GPS, grid soil samples and a good yield map, you can create a script that takes both of those into account. And when you can do that, that's a nice way to manage fertility. The other thing I would say is I like annual fertilizer applications. I'm not a 2-year spread guy. I spread every year, every acre, every year. So your application costs are higher, but your annual fertilizer usage is less. Your soil tie-up is less. Fertilizer is more efficient if you don't put on 2 years worth at one time. And if you like to do removal rate spreading, you can apply what you just removed. And you know what you just removed because you got your yield map. So maybe if you're typically a 2-year spread person, maybe this is a year to just do it 1 year at a time. It doesn't sound like, talking to the people that I've talked to, that there's any hope that things will be better by spring. In the fertilizer situation, they could frankly get worse before spring. So if your plan is to wait till spring and people will get their head out of their and fertilizer will be cheaper, that's probably a risky strategy, based on the people that I've talked to that I trust. So we are going to cut back on our farm this year. I'm doing 3/4 removal is what I'm putting on. I just pulled that number out of the air, and that's using 3/4 as much this year is going to be a lot more money than I spent on a full rate a year ago. So I've had people ask me, well, what if I just keep my budget the same? Well, if you keep your budget the same, you're probably only going to be putting on about half what you did a year ago, which, if your soil tests are good, might not be the end of the world. P&K, a little more flexible. I'm not changing my sulfur plans, so I'm using actually more sulfur this year than I did last year because I don't think most people are using enough sulfur yet. So I'm going to skimp a little bit on P&K, invest more money in sulfur. And if you're a corn grower, you're probably not going to be skimping on nitrogen. Most people are not applying what I would consider to be an excess level of nitrogen. We've kind of quit doing that years ago, and we're being pretty efficient with our nitrogen. So, maybe you could shave, 10 or 20 pounds out of your nitrogen application, but unless you're throwing, 200 units plus on bean stubble, I don't think you're over applying nitrogen in the first place. And so unfortunately for corn, regardless of what nitrogen costs, you're probably not going to change your nitrogen rate too much. Now it does become, there is that law of diminishing returns, and the optimum nitrogen rate at $500 a ton is higher than the optimum nitrogen rate at $1,200 a ton. But it doesn't change as much as the price changes. So the optimum rate might go down 10, 20% at most, while the price more than doubled. So they don't change proportionate to each other. So you can't keep your nitrogen budget the same, but you might be able to shave that rate back a little bit. And the last thing I would say on nitrogen, I have had guys, the inhibitors themselves are fairly costly. Over the years, there have been people ask the question, well, if I could put on 40, 50 pounds more nitrogen for what I'm paying for the inhibitor, why don't I just do that? I don't think I'm going to lose that much. So aren't I money ahead just to over apply nitrogen versus using the inhibitor? If you're just strictly looking at economics and agronomics, I kind of follow that thought. From a stewardship standpoint, that looks really, really, really bad. So that's not something that we want to recommend people doing. But I have seen people that when things, when the budget gets tight because the fertilizer gets expensive, they want to pull the inhibitor out to try to save some money. They don't want to cut the nitrogen rate back, but you can pull the inhibitor out and then spend more money on nitrogen and then keep your total cost down. Well, that actually, to me, makes no sense because the inhibitor, in theory, is worth more to you the more expensive nitrogen gets. So you're somewhat wasting nitrogen if you're not using an inhibitor. And if you want to waste nitrogen, you ought to do it when it's cheap, not when it's expensive. So I would not recommend pulling out the inhibitor as a way to save money. If you think you can shave your rate a little bit without sacrificing yield, I would do that. The trick is you want to look for places you can cut back on fertility that don't sacrifice yield. Because as soon as you start to lose yield, you're probably losing more income than you're saving. And so you're going backwards at that point. Does that kind of address the fertility stuff, Jennifer?
I think so. We had a question actually come in specifically from Drew Kastner. I think you covered it, but I just want to make sure. So he had asked, due to high prices and possible shortages of products, would you recommend doing higher NH3 in the fall and then doing side dressing or other nitrogen passes in the spring? I think we kind of covered it, but just kind of recap that one.
There is a few more layers to that onion there. So yeah, if your typical program is, let's say you do a half quarter. Let's say you're doing half anhydrous in the fall, a quarter UAN with your herbicide as a carrier at planting, and then a quarter side dress. So if your half is your cheap source and your quarter are more expensive nitrogen sources, I don't know how much wider as a percentage the spread will be between anhydrous and UAN this year, but the gap is going to be pretty wide. So guys that like to use UAN solution are used to paying more per unit than guys pay for anhydrous. They're both going up. I don't know if UAN is going to be even disproportionately higher than anhydrous. I'm not a fertilizer pricing expert. Says my battery's running low, Jen. Am I not plugged in like I think I am? Oh, that's why we got a producer here. We'll have to check on the battery issue. But anyway, if you're thank you. If you're using a more expensive, source of nitrogen for half of your nitrogen needs, that's going to drive your cost up more than using a more expensive source of nitrogen for a fourth of your nitrogen needs. So, and actually the question I got from the guy wanting to know, should I use more N-Serve because I'm going to apply more UAN or more Anhydrous, is doing exactly what you're talking about, Drew. He is thinking about doing a higher rate of Anhydrous than he normally does, and then doing less UAN in crop than he normally does, just to keep costs down. So again, if you're just looking at pure economics, I see the logic in that. I like those in-season applications. I don't want to do 100% in the fall. I think the UAN at planting is very important, especially if you're not applying starter with your planter. If you're putting starter on with your planter, you probably don't need the UAN broadcast with the herbicide. If you're not applying starter with your planter, then I think the UAN broadcast with herbicide is essential, in my opinion, especially corn on corn, but I like it on every acre. So you need to have, in my opinion, at least 30 units on bean stubble. I'd rather see 45 or 60. And if it's corn on corn, you need 60 at a minimum, 60 units of nitrogen readily available to that seedling plant, either right before planting, right after planting, right close to planting, because that anhydrous that's 6-8 inches deep, and some of it, hasn't even converted to nitrate yet. If you did things right in the fall, it is not available to those little seedling plants that have roots that are only that deep. It doesn't know that anhydrous is there. So if you're doing fall anhydrous and nothing in the spring, that corn plant's going to be starved for nitrogen early in its life. So, do we do less side dress? That depends on the season. Some years are, this was a pretty good year for side dress this year with all the moisture that we had. Typically, wet years favor side dressing, dry years favor putting it all on up front. So if your crystal ball is good enough to know what next summer's weather is going to be, that tells you whether you need side dress or not. If you know the answer to that question, you probably make more money doing something other than raising corn. So it's always a crapshoot with that, but yeah, I think there will be people that kind of look at, okay, can I save more money by using a different form of nitrogen, or by side dressing less, or putting less on at planting? Just be careful that you're not, hurting yourself. You can't save your way to prosperity sometimes, and if you're, saving $10 at a cost of 5 bushels of $5 corn, you don't want to save 10 and lose 25. And that's actually fairly easy to do if you start cutting corners on a high value, high yield crop like our corn is currently. So good question. And I think a lot of people are contemplating those sorts of things right now.
All right, Lance, I want you to get your crystal ball out again, because especially this year, we had a big disease pressure we've talked about. Elephant in the room, right? So yep. I want to go back to that fungicide conversation if I could for a minute. I actually had an in-territory question from one of my dealers, John Stock, this week. And he was wondering, he did one full rate application at VT.
Yep.
Is there a question of whether we should be splitting that up? What's your rate look like? Once again, we're not a commercial here, but what's your product recommendation for fungicide? Once again, we don't know what 2022 is going to look like, but make your best guess and let us know.
Yeah. Well, I'll go way out on the limb. And when you're built like me, it's dangerous to get way out on the limb. I'm going to make a bold prediction that 22 will be a lot different than 21. So that's what my crystal ball says.
Like it.
So doesn't mean it'll be better. I hope it is, but it'll be different. So everything we learned in 21 tells us that when you're having a growing season like this year, you can't spray fungicide too much. And we talked about that on previous episodes. So the V5 was huge this year for suppressing crown rot. I've seen bigger yield responses this year from a V5 than I typically see from VT. And I've seen the biggest yield responses we've ever seen to V5 and VT. And I've never before seen a year where you could spray corn with fungicide at early dent and increase yield, but you could this year. So if you just did nothing all summer but spray fungicide, that would have made you money this year. Hopefully this year is an anomaly. If this year becomes the new normal, that's going to be kind of depressing, but I don't think that's the case. So to answer that question specifically, I think a V5 fungicide is a good place to start to help suppress crown rot and maximize yield potential. V5 fungicide don't do squat for tar spot. So let's just get that out there right now. If you saw a benefit to V5 fungicide, it's not because you had less tar spot. It's because you had healthier roots from less crown rot. So I think V5 is a good place to start. It's the cheapest fungicide application to make. It typically goes out at less than a full rate. And it typically hitches a ride with the herbicide application, so you don't have any application costs to it. So if that's your situation, to me, the V5 is a no-brainer. Delaro works great in the V5. Other products do as well, but we really like that high triazole load in that early V5 application. There have been some people playing around with the typical recommendation at V5 has been a half of a standard rate, which is about a third of a full label rate. So we'll talk about that full versus standard here in a minute. But in the case of Delaro, 4 ounces has been what people typically run. I saw some great results from 6 ounces this year. I've had people tell me they've ran full rates and thought that was better. Again, in 2021, you could not use too much fungicide. So, we're going to play around with maybe some 3/4 and even some full rates in those V5 applications. I think we talked about this maybe on a previous episode. I wish I had an old pull type sprayer set up with a banding. So one of those banding units where you got 3 nozzles, you got 1 spraying down from the top, 2 coming in from the side, and all you're spraying is the row. That would be really cool to play with V5. You could probably spray V3 corn if you had a sprayer like that, because you can just literally just spray the plant, and then you're not wasting spraying on all that bare soil. So anyway, that's a little bit on V5. I think if you're going to do a tassel time application, and I hope you all will, VT is the time we're going to target. I think VT is a good time that is early enough to suppress tar spot early and keep it from going crazy. However, it's probably not late enough to give you protection all the way through grain fill in a year where we have bad tar spot and bad southern rust, which have the ability to keep infecting all through the growing season. There is no fungicide that will give you season-long protection from a tassel time application. So you might wonder, well, should I wait till brown silk to stretch that control later? Well, if you wait till brown silk, you did extend your control later, but you didn't give the plant more days of protection. You just shifted it back by 2 to 3 weeks. And in the case of tar spot, what that allows the tar spot to do is get going really, really, really good before that fungicide gets applied. And if that tar spot gets a head start on you, it's really hard to put that genie back in the bottle. So to answer John's question directly, Jan, I think starting with a V5 to give you some crown rot suppression. VT should be your target application. If you're only going to spray once late, no matter what happens, I would say go with that full rate instead of the standard rate. So in the case of Delaro and Delaro Complete, standard would be 8 ounces, full would be 12. Almost every product on the market has a higher rate that's considered their full rate than what the standard rate that they normally recommend. So check the label on the products that you're using. Look, the price difference is going to be fairly significant. If you go from 8 to 12, that's going to be 50% more cost than just 8. So it does add a lot of cost. If you are open to the idea of making that VT application and then watching and seeing what happens, and what we're going to look at is there are university models that are being developed to try to predict what's the likelihood of tar spot being bad based on weather patterns. You can watch areas that you didn't spray. You can look at fields of your neighbors that didn't get sprayed. If you made that VT application at a standard use rate and things are bad, and for tar spot, bad would be relatively cool, humid, wet, cloudy, hazy, low light conditions, basically a repeat of the 21 growing season, then I think you need to be prepared to make that second post-tassel application at about R3 or the roasting ear stage. So not many people have ever sprayed fungicide then. They've either sprayed earlier than that, or in this case, Some guys sprayed really late this year. There were some second post-tassel applications made at early dent, way too late. But this year, even those applications that were way too late, in most cases, gave a 20 to 25 bushel yield increase. So the ROI was very positive on those late applications, even though they were, in my mind, probably too late. So I would say if you want to design the best bulletproof fungicide program that I hope we don't have to use, it would be V5 at a half or higher rate, half of a standard rate, not half of a full rate. VT at somewhere between the standard and the full rate. And then be prepared for a second post-tassel shot at R3 if the sky is falling from a tar spot and southern rust standpoint. If you're willing to do the double shot after tassel, I don't think there's a need to go the full rate with the first one. I think 8 fall, if we're talking in terms of Delaro complete, talking our rate structure, I think 8 followed by 8 would be fine. I don't think you need to do 12 followed by 12. Although this year that would have been better than 8 followed by 8. So if we're having a year like this, it's really hard. Like I said before, I'm sounding like a fungicide salesman, and I'm not. But it would have been really hard to use too much fungicide in 21. We're seeing, you've probably seen this in your fields, the overlap areas where like you sprayed and then your neighbor sprayed, you drifted on each other. Those field edges are like 40 bushel better than out in the field. If you've got overlap areas or heavy streaks in the field, they're 40 plus bushel better than the areas of the field that were, and that's not even comparing fungicide to no fungicide. That's like a 2x rate versus a standard rate maybe is 40 bushel different in a field. So just crazy responses to fungicide this year. Like I say, I don't expect to see that next year because every year is different. But one more quick one, and we're going to go over time here. And Jennifer, I know you might need to scoot. If you do, just run. I did get a question that came in on green stem soybeans this week that was a good one. So thank you, Bruce, for that question. I'm going to touch on that real quick, even though we're over time. So green stem soybeans can happen for multiple different reasons. It's very environmentally driven. It is influenced by variety. There are some varieties that just tend to have tougher, greener stems. What that tells me is that plant was very healthy at the end of its life. So soybeans, we talked earlier about them being a pleasant surprise this year. Soybeans have finished well. Corn finished terribly. So the two crops are in complete opposites of each other as far as how they're finishing the season. Soybeans didn't die early. Soybeans hung on forever. Soybeans kept increasing yield. Soybeans took advantage of the late rains. They took advantage of a good growing environment late season, and they just kept adding yield because the plant didn't die early. Corn was just the opposite. It was shooting for 300, fell down about 200 yards before the finish line, and crawled across the finish line was kind of how the corn crop finished off. So very different response there. Soybean plants that are green stemmed and high yielding is kind of the tough cutting is a pain. But if your tough cutting beans are making 85 or 90 bushel, usually guys will be okay with the tough cutting beans. The one scenario where you can have tough beans that are low yielding is if you had a lot of pod abortion. So if you lost a lot of pods, and so that plant is, let's say they're not yielding particularly well, and you're looking at them and there's not that many pods on that plant, that was a scenario where that soybean plant had excess resources that it could not use because it didn't have enough seed to fill to utilize the resources that it had, and those extra resources are what's keeping that plant healthy and alive. So you might not realize this, but a lot of the really high yield soybean guys, so people that are setting yield records with soybeans, typically have to do a defoliant application on their soybeans to kill them so that they can harvest them timely. So we've actually played around with that using we're using some defoliants in seed corn production. We've played around. One of our researchers, Jason Carr, has done some trial work looking at using defol in soybeans can you make them easier to cut when the grain is at the right moisture versus you got to let the plant die down to the point where you can get the plant through the machine by that time, it's been ready to cut for, the grain's been ready to harvest for 2 or 3 weeks in some cases, and we've probably lost some yield potential. So that's just a little bit on the green stem. We'll probably visit that in more depth in a later episode. Apologize for going over time. Producer Jennifer had to run, so I'm going to log off here. And reminder, November 4th will be our next episode. And send in those questions, either email or text, and we'll catch up with you next week or next 2 weeks from today. Everybody stay safe, and we'll see you again soon. Thank you.